So, Prot Paladin is the strongest tank in the game. Funny how that turns out. Does it deserve it? Did it happen because people complained a lot? I'll be talking about the spec as someone who is not a top player, dabbles into casual content, but also cleared +10s with Prot Paladin as my alt character, so that hopefully more people can enjoy this gem of a spec. Prot Paladin is literally the best tank in the current season, with no actual competition across the board. This is probably not fine, and I am saying this as a Prot Paladin enjoyer, it being my tank of choice that I decided to play way back when beta, even after it got nerfed into the ground. I will tell you why Prot Paladin being this good is not actually that good for the game, however much flack I will get from the community. First, let's talk about why it is good, at least for the majority of players, while also thanking today's sponsors, our Patreons. Have you ever wondered, gee, wish this video came out earlier, wish I could see Flame being shit at saying things in front of the camera, wish I could have my cool transmog immortalized in glorious 4K resolution as my wallpaper. Patreon.com/Marcelian&Online, where not only do you get to back up your boys, you get some cool shit along the way. Thank you, Patreons. In terms of Prot Paladin being meta, the most obvious reason is that it has the highest DPS out of all of the tanks. That doesn't usually say much, since there will always be a tank that does more damage than the other tanks, and sometimes that is not even important enough to make a tank meta. This time, however, the damage difference is way higher, so high that you could essentially put Prot Paladin on a different tier than the rest of the tanks, with maybe even an open tier between all of them to showcase how big the gap is. This is also a very good time to point out that this is talking universally, and however contradictorily it sounds, being shit at saying things in front of the camera. Being shit. Contradictorily shit. It's from the point of view of the top players as well. Universally, in the sense that if you take a broad spectrum of players of all skill levels and all specs being played, Prot Paladin will be on top. But at the same time, the best Prot warriors will out DPS an average Prot Paladin. However, the best Prot Paladins will not be out DPS by any other tank. What this all means is this is an observation and not something you need to expect out of every Prot Paladin in your group. Just because Yoda is a god amongst men doesn't mean that anybody can play at that level. Shout out to Yoda, by the way. Check his channel out when you finish watching this, cause man, dude has some killer Prot Paladin content if you are interested. The damage is on the Lightsmith hero talent at the moment, but Templar was always close behind, and actually after you watch this video, the Lightsmith nerfs might have already hit, which are not as big as people might think, probably around 4% in single target and 9% in AoE. Based off of the Theory Crafters math in the Paladin Discord. The performance will still be ahead of any other tank choice, and that is due to more than just raw DPS. Prot Paladin always had high DPS even before the buffs, its problem being mostly the tankiness, which was buffed and reworked in 1105 when the whole of the Paladin class got changes in their class talent tree. This brought back defensives to be a bit stronger and more accessible, together with some buffs in the spec tree to increase their availability. Without going into the deep end, what you need to know is that both damage and survivability are top tier. Another thing to understand is that Prot Paladin being strong past the mid-season at the beginning of an expansion is not new. This exact thing happened in Dragonflight as well. Of course, the reworks and buffs helped, but there is also another aspect that I believe makes Prot Paladin the strongest tank in the game, period, outside the devs outright killing it intentionally. That is the secondary stats and the fact that Prot Paladin scales the best with them out of everyone, more or less. First of all is haste, which, similar to warrior, demon hunter and bear, increases the speed of the spec through the raw effect, but also because a lot of the core abilities have a hasted cooldown. This means that their cooldown gets lower the more haste you have, and having more haste means your global cooldown between abilities is lowered as well. This makes you deal the damage faster, but also build your holy power faster, which translates into faster mitigation on top of more damage. damage. Since you use key talents that reduce the cooldown of your defensives when you play, like Gift of the Golden Valkyr, Resolute Defender, and Righteous Protector, you end up solving tankiness issues by having your big defensives way more often. On top of haste, Crit is the ideal stat to take, especially in dungeons. Not only will it increase your damage output the most, but also provide you with parry chance. The time you are most in danger is when fighting a lot of enemies at once, and parry chance works wonders there since you end up taking a lot of attacks that you will negate the damage of when parrying. Normally we would stop here, but ever since Shadowlands, I believe, your mastery has been a big contributor to your tankiness through its passive damage reduction. This made Paladin one of the few tanks that got a lot, if not similar, survivability value from all secondary stats. Where all other tanks really only want 2 of them for their kit, Paladin benefits from all 4. Of course, the other secondary stats are good for the other tanks as well, but none of them scale with them the same way that Prot Paladin does. On top of mastery giving you damage reduction in consecration, it will also increase your block chance, but more importantly your spell block chance, which is the real kicker here. Let's use my character as an example. I have a baseline 27% block chance with my current mastery level, which is way lower than where it is supposed to be. When I talent into Holy Shield, I will have an extra 20% block chance, bringing it to a rough 47%, which of course with a Holy Shield talent means spell block as well. Add to this the improved Holy Shield, which gives me 8% more, for a total of 55%, and 2 more talents that will actively add block chance when I play right. Barricade of Faith makes Avenger's Shield increase my block chance by 10%, and Faith in the Light gives me an additional 15% per the 1 point I have in after using Word of Glory, giving me a total of 80% block chance for spells. If I can squeeze about 5,000 extra mastery from gear in exchange for some crit, I will get to 100% block chance, which means that all magic damage that can be blocked will do 35% less damage to me if we take my current stats into consideration, which is more than I think any tank can deal with at the moment. Of course, getting there will likely not happen for me since I main a mage and don't have that much time to grind that gear on an alt, but can definitely happen to people who are pushing myth level content, meaning mythic rating or plus 10 keys. This content is indeed higher than what most people can do, but if you cannot do it, you don't need to worry since the content you can do won't need you to be at 100% block chance anyway, and you don't need that in all raid and dungeon fights to begin with. The point is to showcase why Prot Paladin is so giga good. On top of this, we have party utility that is important to consider. The Cleanse Toxins removes probably the second most dangerous debuff in the game, which is poison, at the moment anyway. This is really good on a tank since poisons will be the one killing you more than any other dispel outside bleeds, which cannot be dispelled unless you are a dwarf or an evoker, both having nothing to do with Prot Paladin directly, and coincidentally both being in very high-end mythic plus keys. Maybe not that coincidentally now that I think about it, where bleeds become a real problem. Blessing of Spell Warding and Protection are immune to magic and physical effects respectively, which can be used to negate mechanics for yourself or your party members. Blessing of Protection actually removes bleeds as well, although you normally never want to cast this on yourself, but Divine Shield will be able to remove everything off of you that is negative, of course, while also making you immune to damage. Mechanics in WoW are usually created around party compositions that can remove them in some way, but if you have an immune tool, which Prot Paladin has 3 of, you can subvert a lot of issues that people actually have to learn to deal with normally. That alone gives you access to a different gameplay that no other spec can accomplish, making Prot Paladin a really unique spec. All of these can make it a pain to balance the spec in relation to everyone else. You are a shield tank wearing plate armor, but having a lot of armor, a lot of HP, and passively a lot of tankiness will make your very strong defensives push you ahead of all the other tanks even more. This is likely what caused the devs to nerf Prot Paladin in beta and likely every other time in the past. And if not, then it definitely makes sense that they would. And when they did, the spec felt awful. Dying as fast as a DPS player is not a fun tanking experience, and it got a lot of people talking, myself included, pointing out how terrible the balance felt. Personally, I'm not interested in playing an overpowered spec, that's just boring. But I did do my share of whining about putting a spec below the bottom of the barrel, something that felt unfair, unjust, and simply a turnoff when choosing to play the spec. I'm very happy that they listened and buffed it back, but I believe they might have overdid it. What do I mean by that? Buffs are too big, and I can tell you what I mean by simply discussing how strong a tank should be. This is tied directly to how the content is tuned, so in the end maybe the buffs are not big, but maybe the other tanks are too weak. Let's say that content is a plus 20 key, since Mythic Plus scales way past Mythic rating. The question is, should tanks be able to survive plus 20 keys? I believe they should, and let me tell you why and how. Like I mentioned, if the plus 20 is too high for tanks to survive, that marks the end of the content push, unless we are talking about cheesing the game with snap mechanics, intricate kiting and all of that, which is fine, but it's just not tanking anymore. Putting an artificial cap on how high the content can scale in a presumed endless scaling content feels counterintuitive, but tanks cannot be immortal either. As with what many other people have said before, the wall people should hit shouldn't be survivability, but rather lack of damage. From the tank's perspective, Prot Paladin or otherwise, the spec should be designed in such a way that if I do giga damage on a plus 19 and my party clears it, and on a plus 20 I die with all of my defensives up, I should have a way to sacrifice my damage to be able to survive up to a point where I do close to no damage, but I'm close to being immortal. This is in principle, by the way, and in the context of an endlessly scaling RPG system. Implementing this without changing the rest of the content is ludicrous, of course. You can't just make tanks immune to damage, but if we will have mythic keys that scale to infinity, presumably, players should have options to scale their characters in a similar way, or there should be a cap on how high dungeons can go. So let's say that 20 would be the max. If you clear at 20 in time, there would be no 21. At that point, the end game becomes about how fast you can clear that plus 20. So it should be either one or the other, but it's a little of both while accomplishing neither. And this creates balancing issues, such being the nature of endlessly scaling content in an MMO. Maybe Mythic Plus is fundamentally flawed because of it, and until that changes, you will always have issues with meta tanks, which is the problem with the current tuning of Prot Paladin. Before Prot Paladin was buffed, the top tanks were actually two, almost three: Prot Warrior and Guardian Druid, with Vengeance coming in close behind. For the health of the game, that was better since more people got to play more specs, more compositions that they enjoyed, and not be shoehorned into one option. It would have been unrealistic to expect it to be that way all throughout the end of the season, but at least there was a healthy competition. Unfortunately, that healthy competition came with Prot Paladin and Brewmaster Monk being completely terrible at the high end. And I want to emphasize high end here, and not for every player. That changed after the Prot Paladin rework and the buffs to the point where there is no competition, which also unfortunately came with close to nothing gained by Brewmasters, making the rift between it and the top tank, currently Paladin, even larger, where they are about 3 to 4 keys apart in terms of how high they push, while before it used to be about 2 key levels. Prot Paladin is the best tank after all, despite its beginnings, and I believe there are a few lessons to learn here. 1. Prot Paladin shouldn't get nerfed, because that would essentially nerf every other player together with the endgame, but instead, 2. Every other tank should receive compensatory buffs to bridge the gap between them and Paladin. 3. Tankiness should be a choice between it and DPS, to the point where tanks can be super tanky and deal little damage, with threat being considered of course, or do high amounts of damage but require more healing. That, or put a cap on how high keys can scale, which I can bet money will upset people more than just being tougher. Prot Paladin has skyrocketed in popularity, where it is now the second most played spec in dungeons, showcasing that people like to play strong specs that can smash content. Maybe this means it's better to have fun than always be challenged. Maybe this means that WoW is about power fantasy in these modern times, and when you choose to give some specs that power and not others as well, the ones lacking end up just not being played or played less. Conclusion: play Prot Paladin if you want to feel like a tank. It's good, it's strong, and likely will get you easier into groups now that the community perception has swapped like moths to a flame. And if you are interested in how WoW can easily be fixed, check our video right here, where we point out how WoW will be a better game with some tweaks that could actually be already on the way.